Hello and welcome to FTD Talk. My name is John James and I'm writer and campaigner for male victims of female perpetrated domestic violence. Every week on the show I have been talking to male victims of abuse on a number of subjects, from family court to domestic violence to even rape. This week I have something different for you. This week I will be talking to Deborah Powney, a PhD psychology candidate in recovery and growth in male and female intimate partner violence. She'll be talking to me about her survey and explaining why the survey was created and what it shows. This is Deborah's interview. So hi Deb, welcome to FTD Talk.
Thank you.
And before we start, can you tell me and the listeners a little bit about yourself and the kind of research that you do?
Yeah, so I'm a PhD candidate at the University of Central Lancashire. I've now been studying victims of abuse for, going on for 5 years. Previous to that, I was in industry. I worked in business, in big business. But I reached a point in my life when I decided to follow my passion, due to my first marriage being horrifically abusive, both physically, which was horrible when it happened, but relatively rare. But every day of my life was an experience of coercive control. And I met my husband now, my second husband, whilst I was had been separated divorced for a number of years from my previous husband, but was still being dragged through court by him. And I was working full time and then got to the point where I thought I really need to do something a bit different with my life. And my husband asked me two very simple but life-changing questions. One was, what have you always wanted to do with your life, which was psychology. And the second question was, what's stopping you? And the bizarre thing is that really simple question is quite profound, because you can't really make the excuses not to do what your heart desires. So I went back to university with one burning question in my mind, which was, how did I get myself into that mess? And from that question, I discovered such a vast array of not just current literature and research in the field, but also gaps in the field, predominantly the gap of male victims of intimate partner violence. And then that led me to try to explore why there was a gap in the evidence, because as a victim stroke survivor of domestic abuse, it had never crossed my mind that men couldn't be. I understood that women were, and I didn't feel like I fit the sort of narrow template of what was described as a female victim of abuse. But having suffered that level of what could be described as torture, it never entered my head as a woman that would exclude men. But it was interesting that the literature that I was reading clearly did. And I've said this often, but it led me to open the lid and jump down a rabbit hole of research. And I haven't yet hit the bottom, and I don't expect to. So it's my actual PhD is called, rather convolutedly, Compensatory Consequences of Intimate Partner Violence in Male and Female Victims. And what that is, in a nutshell, is looking at how male and female victims of intimate partner violence adapt positively, and how I investigate how they can move from something really horrific to use strengths that may develop as they adapt to the trauma they have been through. So some of the evidence that came through from a meta-analysis I did was that people can find that they really appreciate their friendship bonds more, and make an effort with their friendships and relationships, often because victims of partner violence have been isolated from friends and family, and they gain a real appreciation not only for those people that are in their lives, but also empathy for those people around them. There tends to be a really beautifully opposed adaptation, in as much as we really have empathy, a lot of empathy and understanding for people, but we also don't tolerate bullshit. And I think there's a real skill in that as well. So they victims of abuse tend to, those that are positively adapted tend to have this beautifully encapsulated real belief and empathy in people, but they can sift out bullshit instantaneously. So but although that seems like a very narrow topic, the research that underpins that is vastly wide. So I end up looking at the politics in this arena, the industry of money and business that's in this arena, why even ideology, religious-based ideology and cult membership I research to better understand why there is this exclusion of male victims. And it really is kind of grounded in what you could call a religious ideology of certainly radical feminism, and the beliefs of a large proportion of what is predominantly female victims that believe the dogma that is being put out there. But also, if I take a step back into my former life, there is a huge amount of money embedded in this. And as a consequence of that, there are thousands upon thousands of people's livelihoods and lifestyles embedded into keeping the patriarchal version of domestic abuse running.
Yeah, I noticed on, I think it's the Women's Aid website, that it actually says domestic abuse is a gendered crime.
Yeah, it actually, the sentence continues from that by saying women are victimized because they are women, which is ideological. It is in no way scientific. And it's also one of the biggest bugbears I have with that level of ideology is that that's harmful for women. And it prevents recovery, because if you're a woman that believes that particular dogma, how do you ever not be a victim? Because you're a victim by accident of birth. And not only are you trying to map out your own recovery and probably that of your family, and I don't just mean children, I mean wider family, how are you going to overturn gender? Do you see what I mean? So there's a real victim status, and I've said this in a prior interview before. What they tend to do is then start talking about empowerment. That we want to empower women, we want to empower them, and that's harmful as well, because there's a real difference between empowerment in the way they are framing it and recovery. Because I'm seeing a lot of women that are, and if you could see me, I'm doing the inverted commas sign, empowered, that are displaying clear trauma response and really could benefit from some cognitive behavioral therapy, because their thought patterns have become distorted. They think in black and white consequences. They are sifting data or information that's being put in front of them, and all the very aspects that would be treated by a cognitive behavioral therapist. So I don't think that level of ideology helps women at all.
Do you think that women then are brought up to see themselves as victims,
I
or
don't,
do you think?
I don't think women are brought up that way at all. I
Mhm.
think all the friends that I have, and obviously I'm not speaking for all women, but all the friends I have, and you can imagine that we've spoken at length of this topic because I'm fairly passionate about it. None of them identify as feminists, and all of them are really strong, capable business owners or mothers or whatever. And there is not a whiff of being brought up as a victim.
Yeah.
However, what I would say is that organisations like Women's Aid have put themselves as the forefront of, and the first gate, as it were, for female victims to contact if they need help and support. And I can speak from experience. And I must say, when I was going through my hell, I did phone Women's Aid, and they put me in contact with a local organisation that absolutely helped me and supported me. But the message that came through from Women's Aid was very much of that ilk. This has happened to you because you're a woman. We help women. It's a huge issue for women. It was very much framed that way. And I didn't accept that even before I'd set a foot into the level of psychology I'm doing now, because I know for a fact that my ex-partner didn't abuse me because I was a woman. I didn't know what, I couldn't name why he was abusing me at the time, but now I can absolutely say that it was narcissistic personality disorder. But I knew it wasn't because I was a woman.
Yeah.
So I think if you're a woman that is less able to identify that, or has been beaten down into a state of, any kind of port in a storm, why wouldn't you believe that? This is a credible organisation that's been established for a number of years, that has a huge amount of public support and a huge amount of governmental funding. So why would you question that? And that's my concern, that, and then you're on the route to empowerment, but not really recovery.
Yeah, there is a clear difference between those, isn't there? This brings us neatly on to to the survey that you've been having male victims of abuse filling in.
Yeah.
What does the survey measure, and how are you conducting the survey?
Okay, so this survey, my desk is now in my bedroom because it keeps me away from the melee in the house. But I sat on my bed and scribbled that the beginnings of that survey out when the lockdown got announced. And the reason I did that is I had a study that was due to kick off called Walking to Recovery, that has been furloughed but will be back one day in the very near future. And that was about assessing a walking program for male victims. So what I thought is it's going to be some time before I can get a group of men together out in the Lake District, but I really need to get some information about male victims, and I kind of want to take advantage of people being stuck at home. So my thinking behind it was that I can make this a relatively long survey, and I wanted to address some of the gaps in the research that I have found, but also some of the reasons that the gendered model uses to dismiss male victims. An example of which is, often if the gendered model is challenged, predominantly feminist researchers will come back and say, well, the reason it has more impact on females is because men don't feel fear in the way that women do. So I'm a northern lass, and I ask a question to get an answer, not to feign any kind of intellect. So I asked that question: were you or are you afraid of your abusive partner? And the beauty of the information that's come through from my survey is the honesty that's in there, because a certain proportion of men said, no, I wasn't afraid of my partner. But the overwhelming proportion of men said yes. Mm-hmm. And that was not just because of physical abuse, which some of the stories were just horrific. I spent a good deal of my time utterly immersed in this data, which meant there was at least one part of every day where I cried. They were afraid physically of their partner. They were afraid psychologically of their partner, but they were also afraid for their children. And an example of which was a man who said that he was in his relationship for 35 years and he left last year. And I asked two other questions. Why did you stay in the relationship? And then what made you leave the relationship? And he answered that what made him leave the relationship was because my final child had got married and left home. And he'd stayed for 35 years because he knew if he left, he wouldn't get his children and they would be subjected to the abuse he had to endure. So he'd spent 35 years of his life shielding his children until they were happily embedded in their own life.
Yeah.
And that made me cry more than even the torturous physical violence, because that's a life sentence, and he given up his life to protect his children. And there's an honor in that, as sad as it is. I'm kind of tearing up now, but the idea, you would literally get less for murder.
Yeah, you would.
So 35, it just smacks, and it's not a life wasted because he protected his children and he did everything that he could. But to me, it just made me think that he'd given up 35 years of his life. Quite profound.
And I know, speaking from experience, that you definitely are afraid of your partner.
Yeah. The fear is real. There's another guy who left 10 years ago, and there's a lot of closed questions. We obviously do all the demographics and stuff because that helps us analyze data. And there's a lot of closed questions like yes, no, maybe, all the rest of it. But there's also a lot of open text questions. And then there's also 4 psychological scales. And it's probably worth me briefly going through those to tell you what I was looking for. So the first scale is called a controlling behaviours scale. And the reason that's in there is twofold. One, my supervisor is Nicola Graham Kevin, and she developed that throughout her PhD. And she did her PhD under John Archer, who did the first meta-analysis showing that women are equally or slightly higher when committing abuse against a partner. So, and she also did some work with Murray Strauss, and he did the conflict tactic scale that has received a lot of criticism. So this controlling behaviour scale looks at exactly what it says on the tin, the level of controlling behaviours within the relationship. The second scale is called an impact of event scale, and that measures PTSD symptomology. It isn't a defined, you now have PTSD, but it measures the level of symptomology that's still around in that particular individual because it's based on the last 7 days. Then I have what's called the COPE, which is a coping scale. and that looks at 14 different ways of coping, and that can be anything from use of alcohol to planning or various different structural ways of coping. And then finally, there's what's called the post-traumatic growth inventory that maps out positive adaptation, like I was talking about at the beginning of this interview. And that will kind of give me a snapshot of how intensely abusive the relationship was, what the impact of that abuse was, how men have coped with that abuse, and how they've recovered. So it gives me a really I always use quite descriptive words, but a really beautiful way of assessing the impact and also the compensatory consequences that I'm researching in my PhD. So so one of the things, for example, to go back, a man was one of the things that are measured as sleep patterns, and this guy was clearly still having issues with sleep. And when I went back through his data, he was saying that he was afraid of his partner because she used to wake him up by pouring a boiling kettle on him. And he'd left that relationship 10 years ago, but is still struggling with sleep. Now, absolutely, you'd still be struggling with sleep. Because you've been woken up by I nearly swore then. You've been woken up by a boiling kettle.
Swear it. Just go for it.
Well, seriously, my when I looked at that data, it was like a fucking boiling kettle. No wonder you can't sleep.
Yeah.
But I think there's the pressure on people to kind of recover without acknowledging the fact that I would be more worried if you just kind of brush that off. It's like, oh, well, you know, that's fine. That was then, this is now. Because the reason you get PTSD, and this is something else that people don't really talk about a lot, is that PTSD is almost a survival mechanism. You know, you are put on hyper alertness and your body reacts a certain way because you have experienced long-term and persistent abuse.
Yeah.
So it's almost normal. And I know there is treatment for post-traumatic stress and disorder, but I feel there needs to be more understanding about why that is now part of your being. And I'm not sure it's necessarily communicated in that manner. It is definitely seen as something that needs treatment because it's detrimental to that person. But your body and your brain learns from experience. And that is a horrible experience. So go on.
I was just going to say, it doesn't surprise me that you say that. When I spoke to the organisation Abused Men in Scotland, over 18 months they'd had 4 guys call them, and that's exactly what had happened to them. They'd been woken up by a freshly boiled kettle of water being poured over them.
It's terrifying how it makes me feel sick, actually. And there's a small part of me that makes me feel ashamed to be a woman, because, and that's not internalized misogyny, the mythical crap that feminists throw at me, but I felt ashamed because women do weaponize, you know, and they weaponize with horrifically damaging effect. Something so simple in the home, a kettle that we know, me and my husband shout at each other every day. If you knock the kettle on, you know, it's just a normal part of life. But then they also attack when men are vulnerable. So again, this utter bullshit of men are far stronger than women, and you know, in a hand and it's kind of positioned as this hand-to-hand boxing match, and it really isn't. It really isn't like that.
And that's also premeditated as well, isn't it?
Yeah.
You've had to plan that out. You've had to switch the kettle on. And
well, to be honest, so is smashing someone's skull in 20 times with a hammer, but we've seen the consequences of how that elevates someone to a celebrity victim status recently, haven't we?
Yeah.
You know, so if someone can smash their husband's head in with a hammer 20 times and have a sentence quash for that, you know, that what's a boiling kettle going to mean?
That's a scary thought when you put it like that.
Well, it's true.
Yeah.
You know, and let's point out another thing. This sentence wasn't utterly redacted. She still served a number of years under the banner of manslaughter, but now it's heralded as celebrity.
Yeah.
And that's sick.
Yeah, well, anything can make you celebrity now, can't you? But that's just something else.
We've actually seen a rise of this. There is, and this disturbs me, because there's the most common form of domestic abuse is bi-directional. Yeah, there's partners being abusive to one another in one shape or format. Mm-hmm. So I've said this before, that there seems to be this fairy dust that is sprinkled over a victim, even if in this case a woman has also committed abuse at equal measure to her partner who is abusive. There is something sprinkled over her that says, as a woman, you cannot be abusive. And it stems back to the Deleuze model. And not only can you not be in any way held responsible for your part of this behavior, because we're just going to transmute that to self-defense, so don't worry about that. But everything that you've done prior to this event is now dismissed. And anything you do post this event is dismissed, because we'll just write that off as trauma reaction. Mm-hmm. So the females in this instance are given an angelic status. But then not only that, but they are given some kind of professional status, where they're trooped onto TV and asked, what should we be doing now about domestic abuse? And then they're doing training programs and having conferences with the domestic abuse commissioner, when they've got, quite frankly, another swear coming up, fuck all professional experience in this arena.
Yeah.
And I also think there's a level of narcissistic victims that are pushing this arena that shouldn't be allowed anywhere near it. And they're guiding training, political agendas, funding, and they shouldn't be anywhere near it. It's terrifying that someone that has been by that status, why the hell would I do a master's and a PhD? I could have just got myself out of that horrific marriage and then just go, and now I'm an expert.
Yeah.
You are an expert of your own situation, but that doesn't give you the experience to then start guiding political and lawful agendas. But that seems to be what we do. Absolutely terrifying.
Well, with your survey, well, first of all, what did the results reveal?
Well, I only closed the survey on Sunday, so I haven't done all the statistical analysis yet. That will take a number of weeks because there's so much. But I've been told by my supervisor, who has spent at least 2 decades in this field, that this is the largest data set of its type for male victims in existence. And it went worldwide. And to be honest with you, I was thinking, if we get a couple of hundred, that is enough for a quite nice study. It will be published, it will go out there. Because if you actually start delving into this academic data, there are some really small sample sizes about. So 200 would have been great. I'm closing out at 1,300 340 completed surveys.
Wow.
And this is all over the world. I had over 360 from India, I think 280 in the UK, almost, I think about 170 in the US, 200 and odd in Australia, but then various other amounts throughout the world, even Colombia, Croatia, all sorts of places that this has come from. And what I'm seeing across those cultures, and considering that I would have thought that India might have been portrayed more as a patriarchal society, the similarities for male victims across cultures are terrifyingly familiar.
Yeah.
You know, it's looking like this. The results show me that it doesn't matter what age group you're in, it doesn't matter what occupation you do, and therefore occupation can show you the level of economic status, the religion, ethnicity, culture, everything. It doesn't matter, is what's coming through.
It flies in the face of most research that I've read then, because they say there's a gender gap, there's not gender gap, age gap, and economic status gap.
No.
So no gaps at all. Like, so, wow.
So what this tells me, and then there's different ways that the men are abused. Say for example, in India, computing and mathematics came through as the largest occupation, but that's because there's a huge economic push towards those arenas within India, as part of their economic growth into the world economy. But there is a lot of stuff there that I'm going to have to come to grips with fairly quickly about a law called 498A, which is a dowry law, which can not only hold men accountable to their abuse, to their alleged abuse to their wife, it also holds the men's family responsible. And this law is now being used as blackmail and abuse towards men by women. And to the extent that I've been contacted by family members of Indian victims that have said their sons or nephews, aunties play a big part in the culture in India, have either hung themselves or set themselves on fire.
Oh, wow.
So suicide is unbelievably high for men in India. So to give you a cross matching for that, in Australia, the largest occupation, the occupation that received the largest number of surveys were construction and building, because the trade and tradies, they call them in Australia, have there's a lot of building and construction that's going on in Australia, but traditionally construction has been seen as well, we know there's a higher level of suicides in construction in the UK, but maybe this goes some way to answering that. If we're seeing that in Australia there's a predominant push that the tradesmen are being abused by their wives, you know, has that been analysed in the suicide data for construction in the UK? So I'm able to look at some of the patterns that that are being seen across cultures and apply them to other cultures. So if I can find a pattern in Australia with the tradies, then obviously I'd like to get in touch with an organisation that works for suicide in men in construction and say, have you explored if any of them are victims of partner abuse? because
Yeah.
I found this in Australia in a place that's dominated by tradesmen. We found that there was a high correlation between domestic abuse and that particular occupation. So there's so much, the data is so rich that you can really start piecing things together. And for example, what's really come out, because I really wanted to debunk all these questions that the feminist literature puts forward about why male victims shouldn't be taken seriously. And it's one of them is literally about how they get PTSD symptoms and all the rest of it. But that is also linked highly with the coercive control laws. So feminist data says that women are more likely to be victims of coercive control because men commit more coercive control than women. And that is taken without even asking any men if they commit or experience coercive control. So the coercive behaviour scale that we've got in my survey shows that they are highly likely to be victims of coercive control. So what Nikki and I, that's my supervisor, are doing as we speak is developing a survey that solely concentrates as men as victims of coercive control, and we're going to get that out within the next week or so.
Yeah.
So that we can get an absolute focus on that. And that's, that has implications for the coercive control law in the UK that was really pushed through by the feminist agenda. And I'm really glad it is part of our law, coercive control, having experienced it myself, but it shouldn't be gendered. And we've got data and hope to gather more data to show why it shouldn't be.
See, I did an interview with a police inspector who I spoke to her about coercive control, and she said that it's really difficult for a man to prove coercive control because the bar is set at being kept prisoner.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's not the bar for a woman.
No, but we are, believe me, John, we are working on this. And there are various things that I'm working on within my PhD about coercive control that will end up being completed outside of my PhD. So, for example, I'm working on an AI project that will, if successful, will be able to identify coercive control in any text. And that includes text that has been transcribed from speech. So not only will it be able to identify coercive control, it will be able to identify the type of coercive control and end the document with a percentage of how much of this document contains coercive control. And I'm hoping that once that's tested and out in the field, that it could be used by individuals, it could be used by the police, it could be used by solicitors, it could be used by the judiciary in all its ways, shapes and forms. Because the problem with coercive control is that if you take each incident in isolation, it doesn't seem abusive, because a lot of it is very, like a lot of psychology, it only becomes an issue when it becomes a exaggeration of normal behavior. So we all have fallings out with our partners. We've all called our partners names. The problem is with coercive control is that it's a consistent and persistently degrading pattern, and I will tell you the script that I used to have. The script that used to be given to me on a daily basis was, I was a shit mum, I was shit at my job, I was a shit wife, I was crap at this, all my friends hated me, my family was shit. They go through it like a script. But if I was to show someone one text, it's just like, oh well, maybe they're upset, maybe they didn't sleep very well, all the rest of it. And what humans are shit at is spotting consistent and persistent patterns. But what AI, and sorry, that's artificial intelligence for anyone that doesn't know, is particularly good at, and I'm talking about all the algorithms that look at our advertising and all that stuff. What AI is particularly good at is spotting persistent and consistent patterns.
Yeah.
So I have absolute understanding that the police person you spoke to is saying, it's really difficult for anyone to evidence coercive control. But for men, they've got several other issues. The bar is set differently for them, but there's also, like we were talking earlier about the person you interviewed about their sexual assault. There's also this barrier of admitting it. I am a victim of domestic abuse. But then there's also, even before you get to that point, it's even recognizing it's domestic abuse, because our society, led by this really harmful and poisonous ideology, has set up this whole structure that only women can be abused. So how's a man going to understand that he's trying to break that structural understanding of what domestic abuse is before he even goes on to then start recognizing that he is a victim of abuse? So the idea that a police officer is saying, well, it's really difficult for men, no shit, Sherlock, because there's several different layers before it even would get into the police having to assess it.
Yeah, I've heard that on this show that people have said, and I said, why didn't you leave? And they said, I didn't even know it was abuse.
Exactly. And I can tell you something, hand on heart, I didn't realize how bad my abuse, that I was being abused. I realized it was horrible. The situation is, I felt tortured. I didn't know who I was, what time of the day it was. I just knew that I had to concentrate on making sure that everything was right, so I didn't get that abuse every day. But I'd kind of written it off as, his mum and dad split up when he was younger. Oh, he's got an issue with alcohol. Oh, he's just stressed. Oh, you write it off. Yeah. And also, I'd taken my marriage vows very seriously. I didn't want to bring my children up without a father. There was all sorts of elements tied in with why I continued to stay there. And almost at the point where it became so torturous, I'd also then cut off my family, cut off my friends, and actually the only other person than my children I saw on a daily basis was him. So how the hell am I going to escape that?
Yeah, the isolation is awful.
Utterly isolated. It was horrendous. But I didn't use that word abuse until I began to study it.
Yeah.
And then it was literally, I remember looking at the original coercive control model, which is by a guy called Biderman, which was developed from studying male prisoners of war, incidentally. It had nothing to do with Evan Stark, who's taken it as a feminist model. But I remember going through it, and literally it was like a tick list of what my life was. And I think almost we need to get to the point with the police where we say, here is a tick list, hand it to them and ask them, does any of this seem familiar to you?
Yeah.
And don't frame it as a question of, are you being coercively controlled? But quite frankly, John, there's a shitload of psychologists out there that haven't got a fucking clue what coercive control is. So how would anyone else?
Yeah.
So we need to get to the point of literally back to basics that says, have a look at this list. Have any of those behaviours have happened to you? Take out all the jargon, take out perpetrator and victim, take out criminal or domestic abuse or all that, and go, any of this familiar? And I bet if you put that in front of anyone, woman, man, child, and then they just go, yeah. And you score that, and at the bottom of it, you'll go, I'm really sorry, but this indicates coercive control.
Yeah.
And that's the level we need to be at, because all these really malleable, up in the air concepts don't mean anything to people that are being abused.
So stop trying to complicate it and simplify it.
Every single time I ask a really simple question, John, the data comes flooding in. And if I don't know if you've looked at my survey, but if you look,
I have, yeah.
It's really simple questions.
Yeah, it is.
It's really bog standard, because all I need to know is, why did you feel you had to stay? What made you leave? What was it that happened? What was this? I don't need to say, in your opinion, of all the coercive control that may have happened to you, because it doesn't mean anything to anyone.
Yeah.
That's my job now. My job now is to take that data and mine the arse out of it and turn it into information that I can put out to politics, put out to the policymakers, put out to the funders, and people like the police, and say, when you're talking about coercive control, this is what it looks like. This is what happens to these men. You know, you might be looking at someone who's 5'1", and I am 5'1", but what does that matter if she's pouring a boiling kettle over someone who's asleep?
Yeah, yeah.
And this
100%.
is the kind of information, and I am, you know me, John, I am gobby. I shout this stuff, and I intend to take it and shout about it. It needs getting out there, and men really need to know that people are listening. And I also think, and I'm trying not to be sexist here, but I think if you take it in the format I mean it, you'll know what I mean. I don't actually think men can break this. I think it has to come from women. I think women, and I know plenty of them, we need to stand up for men. We need to stand up and say to this gendered ideology, you are wrong. You are wrong on so many levels. You are ignoring men. You're ignoring male victims, because clearly we are. You don't think they exist. By proxy of that, you're also excluding female perpetrators, which means that there is no support mechanisms for female perpetrators, and they are told they are the victims. So they will continue to live in violence, and they'll go from one relationship to the other one, initiating and colluding in violence. And we know from data and research that one of the strongest indicators of a woman being physically hurt is her instigating domestic abuse. So you're condemning that woman to be at higher risk of physical abuse by not giving her a perpetrator program. You are damaging women through not providing effective male perpetrator programs, because it's all based on the Duluth model that we just need to tell men that they shouldn't hit women. And again, no shit, Sherlock. Everyone knows you shouldn't hit. Everyone knows that violence is atrocious. So I think telling someone not to be violent is not really effective. You are letting down female victims that they use as cattle to gain more funding, because you are not providing effective support for perpetrators to be effectively get their behavior adapted so they can live without violence. So you're putting more women at risk, but also you are putting out the message that women are victimized because they are women. So one of the questions I was asked by a woman on Twitter was, how do I know if a potential partner isn't a perpetrator? And I was literally gobsmacked. I was looking at this tweet thinking, you're not taking the piss. You're asking me a genuine question. So I'm going to answer you genuinely and say to you, perpetrators are not the norm. And if I do a rough and ready calculation of, say, the number of women that are abused and divide that, by the number of men in the UK over 18, It works out of less than 1% of men are abusing their partner. And then I often try to get silence with people telling me 2 women a week are murdered, which is horrific, but which is, incidentally, is statistically wrong. But again, if I do the same calculation of 2 women a week murdered divided by men over 18 in the UK, that works out at something like 0.0000039% of men that are murdering their partner. So how does that, horrific as it is, and as disgusting and abhorrent as it is, how does that justify ignoring the recorded 786,000 male victims of domestic abuse?
Yeah, exactly.
And how does that compare to other things that we don't use to wipe men off the radar? What about road traffic accidents? Because I think this year, the latest numbers are 80 women were killed. But the year before that was 63 women were killed. And again, every single murder is tragic and abhorrent. But that's pretty close to zero when there's 32 million women in the UK.
Yeah.
And no one's saying that. And I guarantee, John, if you said that, you'd be accused of misogyny.
Oh, definitely. Definitely.
And when I say it, I get attacked, but I don't really give a shit. I'm telling you fact. I'm telling you fact. You're judging all men and your life, women not going out at night, women asking strangers on Twitter, how do I know if he's not a perpetrator? That comes directly from this ideological model that all men are potential perpetrators because men perpetrate violence against women because they are women.
Well, can I throw a scenario at you then about that question?
Uh-huh.
Thinking about it. If the woman, and I know a woman who's been through this, if that woman who's asked you that question has had nothing but abuse, the woman in question that I know, every single the mother was an abuser.
Yeah.
The first, second, and third boyfriend were all abusers.
Yeah.
So doesn't that, in the victim's head, make abuse the norm?
Yes. And all right, I sometimes reduce things to very simple examples, but that is in no way to diminish the suffering that they have been through. Mm-hmm. But to give an example, if you're when you're growing up as a kid, you're in your house and your norm is everything that goes on in that house. And I mean everything from the way the house smells to what you have for dinner, what time you get up, what washing powder your mum uses, how much time you spend with each parent. There's a normal aspect to your behaviour. And then one day when you're old enough, you go to a sleepover to your friend's house and your friend's house smells differently. I'm not saying bad or anything else. It just has a different smell about it. They eat slightly different food to you. They may eat in front of the TV where you eat at the table or vice versa. They have different rules and regulations and all sorts of things happen, right? And then you suddenly realize as a child, oh, they do things differently from us. So let's take that to something horrific like abuse. So if you're brought up in a family where you are constantly abused, how would you know if someone's life's different if you've not spent time with them? So you just get to the point where abuse becomes the norm, and which means that you might tolerate abuse more than someone who hasn't been in that, had an abusive upbringing. But there's a symbiotic relationship between victim and perpetrator, certainly if the violence is unidirectional. And I know this because in my master's, I was studying psychopathy. And I was reading very early on in my master's, I was reading a kind of pop psychology book called The Wisdom of Psychopaths. It's a really easy read, and it's really interesting, by a guy called Kevin Dutton, I think. Anyway, within that, there was a reference to a paper by a woman called Angela Buck, and she did research on psychopaths and how they target victims. And what she did is she's an academic, and she set up a camera outside of her office at university that filmed people walking away from the camera. So just the back of them walking away. And then she interviewed the people that didn't know they were being recorded, interviewed them and got consent for them to be involved, and asked them if they'd ever been victims of interpersonal violence. So any kind of violence, from mugging, partner abuse, sexual abuse, or all sorts of anything to do with violence of the person. Then she took all that data and went and interviewed psychopaths in high security prison in America. So you're talking like quite serious level psychopaths here. And then she asked them from the films that she was showing them, which people they would target for, whether it was murder, sexual abuse or rape, mugging them, whatever, who they would target. And I can't remember the exact numbers, but a really high proportion of the time, they targeted people that had been previously victimized. So they could target vulnerability from the way someone walked. So I imagine that the woman that you're talking about is quite vulnerable, having endured a life of abuse.
Yeah.
And I imagine there are men out there that either consciously or unconsciously recognize that. So they target her. And because I don't believe that it's patriarchy that is responsible for this level of abuse, my recommendation would be that what we need to do for the woman that you know is really work on her self-esteem, really work on helping her positively adapt, knowing her worth. And I would even go so far in my research to say things like an Alexandra technique, which is all about posture and the way you walk and the way you sit. Because we all know if you're depressed, you kind of slouch over and you go in on yourself and you close in. And sorry, but I'm getting a bit psychology on this. But if you sit back and you raise your shoulders are back and your heads are held high, and that's only a really small part. I'm not saying that is any way going to unpick all these years of abuse, but there's a layered approach that needs to be taken with her recovery. But telling her that she's been victimized because she's a woman is, I believe, equally, it's certainly going to add to the abuse that she sustained, because how the hell is she going to overcome that?
Yeah.
So the difference, I believe, in my opinion, is that telling that woman, oh, it's because you're a woman and it's because of the patriarchy, is about as helpful as a chocolate teapot, but with someone that understands that this is not about patriarchy, this is about violence and aggression and trauma and all the various aspects to that, I would be saying she is in no way responsible for that abuse, but there is agency here where she clearly spots that she's going through this pattern and she's taking agency for that. So what can we do to help that woman not have to endure a life of ongoing abuse?
Yeah.
And that's the difference. The difference between the gender inclusive model is about addressing all these particular levels of abuse and victimization, as opposed to, oh, it's patriarchy.
Mm-hmm.
To me, it's almost like saying it's the equivalent of send thoughts and prayers.
Yeah.
Do you see what I mean? Rather than just rolling your
do,
sleeves up and saying, I mean, I think that woman could get some great help, and she's obviously aware of something that's going on in her life, but this is not going to happen by trying to overturn the mythical patriarchy. She's not going to get better from that happening. She's only going to get better if people recognize that we need not only to understand that she has agency, but we need to work on it so that she has more faith in her own agency.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. And what do you think are the benefits of your study then? How can it help the situation?
I fully intend to deliver this to not only to academia and conference, but I intend to deliver it to the particular countries that have contributed to this. So I've already got lined up sharing the data with Australia through politics, law, and journalism. Do exactly the same here, do the same in America, and currently looking at contacts in India, because I think what tends to happen with a lot of information is that it disappears into the academia and never really hits the impact spots, as it were. Yeah. So I'm going to deliver a copy of this to the Ministry of Justice. I'm going to send it to, well, I'd like to do it by hand to Priti Patel, and I want to deliver it to number 10. I'm also going to send it to the Victims Commissioner and the Domestic Abuse Commissioner, because then they can't deny they've ever seen this. And the sad thing is it's often denied. But I'm just going to keep banging on about it. And journalists are interested. There's various people interested outside of academia, because I'm now currently sat on one of the biggest data sets regarding male victims of partner abuse. And it's my intention to get it out there as widely as possible.
Fantastic.
I've got a big house, John.
Well, that's good. That's good. We need people to shout their lungs off, don't we?
Yeah, yeah.
And because you have, what was it, 1,300 surveys completed?
Yeah, 1,340. Yeah.
And
like I said, in world numbers, it doesn't seem like a lot, but when you can compare it to, so for example, there's an academic that in Australia that I used to argue a lot with on Twitter. I blocked him whilst I was doing this survey because I had better things to spend my time on. But his entire PhD in Australia was based on the study of 17 men and their use of condoms, yet he is seen as an expert on men and masculinity. So that's the level of numbers that people get. Yeah. PhD, that particular person got a PhD on one study based on 17 men, and we're currently sat on a database of 1,340 male victims of partner abuse.
Why do you think if you there's that many men worldwide, as you said, filling in the survey, why aren't men more vocal? Because obviously filling in your survey, they're admitting they've been abused, but why are they not more vocal about it?
Well, I think there's a number of reasons. Some we've spoken about, and recognizing and whatever, but I think there's two distinct areas for me. One is that I think men are concerned that they're going to be turned into perpetrators. And we've seen that, for example, with the Respect Toolkit, that is a document, I think it's a 107-page document that is set up to tell agencies how to deal with male victims of abuse. And this is the organisation that runs the Men's Advice Line. And on page 10, paragraph 4 of that document, they start talking about all terrorists are men. And I've asked the author, why are you talking about men as terrorists in a document that's supposed to be helping vulnerable men? And he started off by saying that, oh, it's just an example of men's use of violence. And I said, why are you using the example of men's violence in a document that's supposed to be helping men that have been victims of violence? And then he said he was told by a higher order not to engage with me. So he clearly had a phone call as we were interacting on Twitter. But I've asked myself this question, and the question is, why have male victims of abuse filled in my particular survey? And I think the answer is trust. Yeah. I think the men that have filled in my survey trust me, or they know someone that trusts me, because people have followed me for a couple of years now, and they've seen the messages that I put out on social media and or been to a conference or watched a YouTube interview of me, and realized that I don't have a feminist agenda. I have a domestic abuse agenda. And by that, I mean, I think it's an issue for everyone that needs to be tackled from that angle. And it's not just an issue for women or feminism. In fact, I would drag feminism right out of this as an issue because it's harmful. So I think the issue is that men need to feel they can trust people in this arena. And rightly so, because on a personal level, I'm sure some of these men have tried to, well, I know they've told me they've tried to disclose in the past and been either laughed at, dismissed, or accused of being the perpetrator. And I think also some men have contributed to surveys in the past, and that data set has been used against them.
Yeah.
So I think the reason my survey has been so successful, and I'm humbled by this, is that the participants trust me. Yeah. And I think that's sadly lacking across the domestic abuse industry for men.
Yeah, I think trust is massively important. Belief is massively important too.
Yeah.
You know, and I know that when somebody tells you a story, you believe them. And so yeah. That's huge. As a victim, that's huge.
You see, my brain works kind of backwards in as much as I still find it funny how someone wouldn't believe them.
Yeah.
It's not about me believing them. It's about, why wouldn't you believe them? You know, it's that.
Yeah, but that's rare. That is rare.
Yes, I know. But again, I find that bizarre. You know, why just because they're men wouldn't you believe them? That's the very epitome of sexism.
Yeah.
You know, it's I find it bizarre that feminism has become a caricature of what it started out as. You know, if you talk to Erin Pitsey, she started out as a feminist, and because she didn't agree with the dogma, not only did she get excommunicated from the feminist movement, she got excommunicated from the very organisation she'd set up, and had to leave the country at one point because people killed her dog and threatened to send bombs through the post.
Jesus.
You know, so this is a movement that is abusive.
Yeah.
Very dangerous. And I've been contacted by women that have been, and again, I'm doing the inverted commas thing, helped by these organisations that have actually said to me, if they knew what they were going to go through, in particularly one in a shelter, if they knew what they were going to go through, they wouldn't have left the abusive relationship.
Jeez.
So this is why when I actually say I believe that the gendered model and the feminist dogma in this industry is harmful for everyone, I'm not just saying it because I'm making this up. I'm saying it because I've got the evidence to back it up.
Yeah.
But then I get called all sorts of things for it. But like I
don't
said,
think. I was just going to say, I don't think you're bothered about that, though, are you?
No, to the point that I'm now saving all the insults and stuff because myself and my supervisor are going to write a paper on it.
Yeah.
No, I put out a tweet yesterday that I've been mulling over, that there's a push towards making misogyny a hate crime. And I put out a tweet with, let me try and find what I said. I asked 3 distinct questions that I've been mulling over about this idea that misogyny should be a hate crime. And I said, so if there is a push to make misogyny a hate crime, what happens when? And I've given 3 examples. 1, I get accused of being a misogynist when I challenge the gendered model, which I often am. Okay. And the reason is that misogyny? And if it is, how am I going to get prosecuted being a woman? But also, if it's not misogyny and I'm being accused of committing a crime, is that then defamation? And I can sue the person calling me a misogynist. So number 2, I get accused of possessing internalized misogyny. So is that a self-hate crime? And would I get prosecuted for that? And then 3rd and finally, although there's probably more questions behind this, if a feminist calls me a patriarchal bootlicker or ask me if I'm a real woman, which does happen, are they, as feminists, then misogynists as well? And do they get prosecuted for a hate crime because I'm a woman? Do you see how they've clearly not thought this through?
Ridiculous.
They've clearly started thinking once again in their dogmatic manner that misogyny is a hate crime by men against women, where hand on heart, John, absolute honesty, I receive shitloads of abuse and not one of it has been from a man.
Yeah.
Every single one of them has been from a woman. And a woman actually asked me once, because they played that I'm a survivor, so I know everything, when they were talking about a gendered process. And I wrote back, well, I too am a survivor and I don't agree with that because of this, 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 and this. And she actually said to me, you don't sound like a victim.
Don't sound like one.
Yeah, and this is a woman who says she's a victim of abuse, who says, me too, believe all women. But if I don't agree with her shitty dogma, then she then doesn't believe me. Can you imagine what would happen if a man said that to a woman? Do you know what I mean? So
yeah, it's absolutely ridiculous.
So is that misogyny? You know, the hypocrisy within this is just... The reason I fight for men is because I think the focus on men is absolutely 3000% needed. But I think it's also the key to unlocking the actual focus and actions required to start effectively tackling domestic abuse in this country, and from what the research is telling me, the world. The fact that this narrative has persisted for the length of time it has is because it's abusive and it's nasty and it's vicious and it's greedy and harmful. I think on some levels it helps women in the immediacy following, you know, if they want to escape. But I think ultimately it's toxic, harmful, and contributes to the whole issue of domestic abuse.
Yeah.
I don't think I can be any clearer than that. I think it's abhorrent in absolutely every element of it. And if anything needs dismantling, it's that.
So what now? What is next for you?
Well, we're going to get the coercive control survey out. We're going to crunch all the numbers. When I say we, I mean me. I like crunching numbers, so we're going to get the papers out. We're going to get them published. I'm presenting this at the virtual ICMI in November. I will, for want of a better phrase, tour this data, make sure it gets out there. I'm going to deliver a copy to the people that I've listed previously, and get this information out there and keep plugging away on it.
Fantastic. Awesome.
I hope so.
Well, thank you for talking to me today. It's been fascinating.
Oh, that's brilliant. Thanks for having me.
Oh, more than welcome. And I wish all the best with the survey and the results. And when you get some feedback, I hope you'll come on the show and talk about feedback.
I'd love to, yeah.
Okay, thanks, Deborah.
It's a pleasure.
Take care now. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Hello, and thank you for listening. I'd like to thank Deborah Powney for her input and support today and for a fascinating conversation. I'd also like to thank all my guests that have appeared on the show so far for bravely telling their stories. I hope that more men will come forward and talk on the show, because it needs to be out there. Male victims of abuse are not a myth. It is so real. And this show provides a safe and non-judgmental environment for which to tell your story. So come on to the show, tell your story, get it out there. Together we can defeat this. No more silence. Until next week, take care. Peace.
Nothing I could do is ever good enough for you. I could barely make it through the day without fear